Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to another installment of The Volundostrian. Today, I actually had someone, a viewer of this channel, request a specific topic, um, which is the first time that's ever happened, and hopefully not the last time, because this is a very insightful uh, topic to be talking about. It's a very topical thing, especially today with all the discussion of gun control and what and especially police brutality and what sorts of uh, violence are permissible in various situations. We've seen dozens uh, of specific police civilian situations come up, and the discussion around them has featured a wide variety of viewpoints. But today I don't want to talk specifically about police brutality, but more generally about the proper use of violence under libertarianism and also how that applies to various types of weapons. Because the topic that was requested was the Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and uh, specifically how I was pro Second Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. But since I've already come out as anti-Constitution in general, it would be difficult for me to then come out as pro Second Amendment. While I do share many of its sentiments, I am against the Constitution as a document, that it does not bind the vast majority, if any, of those people who are currently called citizens of the United States. And that's something we talked about when we discussed Lysander Spooner and his ideas in the pamphlet series No Treason. But today, what we're going to be talking about is libertarianism and weapons. Specifically, I have the subtitle of Study of Proportional Force. That term, proportional force, is going to be very important in a few minutes. So, I wanted to do things a little bit differently today and just give the audience a little bit of time before I started my presentation, just to see if you had any questions for me before I got into my presentation, and then I, after a few minutes here, I then will go into my presentation as I had planned, and then we will also have questions and answers after the presentation if any questions come up there. So I'm just going to give it about 30 seconds right now for anybody to figuratively raise their hand and shoot me a question in the comments. I would absolutely love it if a certain inquisitive mind in the comments would like to uh, hear what I have to say, because that's kind of why I'm here. So I'm just hoping that people would want to hear what I have to say. So I'll give that about 15 more seconds, I guess, and we shall go from there. If there's no questions, then we'll just move on. But hopefully there's at least one question. Well, seeing no questions in the comments at the moment, we're just going to go ahead and move. Oh, we do have a question, um, or a pending question, rather. What do I think about open carry? Open carry in the state of Michigan, but the question was on open carry in the state of Michigan, but rather I would like to expand that to open carry in general. Um, First of all, anytime somebody thinks about open carry, they're probably also going to think about concealed carry as a secondary option. So concealed carrying a weapon, I'm absolutely in favor of anyone owning anything they want to own. So owning a weapon is a part of that, and then we're going to get into that in the presentation. Open carry in some contexts could be considered a form of intimidation, but those contexts are generally very limited. For example, if you showed up open carrying a weapon to a protest and you were a counter protester, that could be taken as a threat of violence. But I would only oppose open carry in those instances where it involves both a threat of violence and an intent to threaten violence. Beyond that, it's just you minding your own business, uh, open carrying a weapon, and if other people are intimidated, then that's their business. But if you are intentionally trying to intimidate others towards some end, then you are committing an aggression against them. And so the whole open carry thing hinges on whether you're committing an aggression against someone else or not, as most things do in the libertarian ideal. Um, so open carry in general, absolutely fine. I am totally in support of anyone owning anything they want to own. But when we talk about specific uses of those things, again, which we're going to talk about specific uses, um, those can be considered criminal or non-criminal, aggressive or non-aggressive, as appropriate. So I hope that answered your question. I support open carry, but except in a very limited number of situations where you could be seen as an aggressor. Um, if we have any other questions, I would certainly love to hear those in just a second or two. What do I think about carrying guns into schools or churches, etc.? So that depends on whose property the school or the church is. Um, if the person who owns the property is okay with it, then I'm okay with it. If the person that owns the property is not okay with it, then I'm not okay with it. Um, and that obviously applies universally in the case of churches because there aren't any publicly owned churches. Um, but if we wanted to talk about carrying guns into public schools, uh, carrying guns into public schools, I mean, there's not really, the state doesn't own the public school. The state isn't really an entity that can do labor and therefore can own things in the libertarian sense of the word. And so if they don't really own anything that they claim ownership to, then they don't really have control over what you bring into where. Um, so in my view, carrying a gun into a state school would be morally allowed. Whether or not that would be prudent under the law as it exists is another question. But carrying a gun into a public school or anywhere that's considered public utility um, would be morally allowed under the libertarian idea because they don't really own what they claim to own, and so they don't really have control over what they claim to control. So carrying guns into schools or churches, ask the person who owns it, and if nobody owns it, as in the case of public utilities, then it's only you exercising control over your own property, and that's just that. The area that you're in is unowned, and therefore no one has the right to tell you not to while you're in the property that they don't own. So I hope that answers that question. Are there any others? But doesn't that infringe on my right to carry? I'm assuming you're talking about where the person who owns the property tells you you can't. Um, in the libertarian idea, what you're doing when you enter into someone else's property, knowing that it's their property, um, you are subjecting yourself to the rules that they have set, assuming that the property that they own is actually justly owned, which is not the case in the case of the state. But if the property is justly owned and you enter the property knowing that it's their property, um, then you subject yourself in some limited sense to the rules that they set, and so in a sense you forfeit that portion of your right to carry, or extended more generally, right to use your property in the way that you want to use it. If the person is okay with it, um, then that's okay. But if the person isn't okay with it, then it would be an act of aggression for you to bring the weapon into their property when they told you you couldn't. because that would be you would then be aggressing against them, their will concerning their own property. Um, so no, it doesn't infringe on your right to not be allowed to carry somewhere that the owner won't let you, because if you try to carry in that place, you are infringing on their right to control the actions of people on their property as it relates to their property. Um, so no, you don't really have the right to carry when somebody says you can't, and it's their justly owned property, at least in the libertarian idea. So I hope that answers that question as well. Do we have any other questions? Seeing no questions at the moment, if you do have a question just before I move on, go ahead and save it for the end of the presentation, and we will get to you then. But we are going to move right along with what I had planned to present. So, libertarianism at its core is a political philosophy, or really it is a political philosophy. And since it is a political philosophy, it concerns itself with politics. And politics is the according to the Google definition that I pulled up, the activities associated with the governance of a country or other area, especially the debate or conflict among individuals or parties having or hoping to achieve power. So I underlined that portion about the debate or conflict among individuals or parties having or hoping to achieve power, because that's what politics is. Politics is conflict, and I'm not just referring to state politics in that sense, uh, because state politics, like even what we would consider democracy to be nonviolent or peaceful, even democracy is violent um, in that sense, and I would take that further and say that democracy is unjustly violent when its participants are involuntarily participating. But even in a perfectly voluntary society, there would still be politics because there would still be conflict among individuals or parties having or hoping to achieve power. And they conflict. The word conflict means to uh, have violence. That's what a conflict is violence. So I would shorten that definition to politics being the study of the proper use of violence. So any political philosophy concerns itself with the proper use of violence, and libertarianism does too. But the way that libertarianism does that is unique compared to any other political philosophy, and that's what I want to apply to this particular question of libertarianism and weapons. So, libertarian politics begins and ends with non-aggression. So, specifically, the non aggression principle that a man's life, liberty, and property are his own to the exclusion of others. And if others try to aggress against his life, liberty, and property, they would be morally wrong. And he would be legally justified in retaliating insofar as to restore, either to prevent imminent aggression or to restore the result of an aggression. So to, for example, steal back what was stolen from him. That is the idea. That is as far as libertarian politics goes, and everything else beyond that is just an explanation and extrapolation of uh, what the non-aggression principle means for that particular politics part of politics. So going beyond that, um, we've already talked about in the questions area before the presentation about the legitimacy of ownership, and I mentioned that I believed it was legitimate to own pretty much anything. It's legitimate to own guns. It's legitimate to own knives. It's legitimate to own bombs. It's legitimate to own clubs. It's legitimate to own swords. It's legitimate to own nunchucks. It's legitimate to own tanks. It's legitimate to own fighter jets. etc. Anything you could imagine that could go in that list is legitimate to own, because ownership is not a crime. Because ownership is, in the libertarian sense, is uh, using labor or trading voluntarily with someone else in order to acquire property. And that is non-aggressive. That entire process is defined to be non-aggressive because those are entirely within the rights of each individual. That's how the non-aggression principle fleshes itself out. So to own anything, um, but that includes weapons, guns, knives, bombs, etc., ownership isn't a crime. So, what does that imply for gun control, or generally the libertarian attitude toward weapons? As I said, it's you can own anything, but we're going to get into certain situations in which you could use um, certain kinds of weapons. Guns, pretty much always. It's pretty much always okay to use a gun. Now, of course, um, there are situations in which it might not be legitimate to use a gun in general. Uh, um, I am indebted in my argumentation here to The Building Blocks for Liberty by Walter Block. I don't know if how well you can see that text, but uh, it covers, I don't know, a dozen and a half different specific political topics from the libertarian perspective, and one of them is gun control. And most of the argumentation from this uh, presentation is indebted to him in the sense that he was the one who wrote it down so that I could read it, so that I could write it down, uh, and then I could present it to you in a more visual format than a book. So he uses the idea of pinpointing when it comes to uh, weapons. So if you can at least in principle, pinpoint the uh, violent action of the weapon into a criminal, then it's legitimate to use. I mean, of course, mistakes happen. So non-criminals are sometimes hurt in the process of uh, in the process of seeking justice against criminals. That's just life. That happens. But it would be legitimate to use a weapon only when you can, in principle, pinpoint the damage against criminals. Knives are another good example. Unless the whole world were packed to the brim with the density of a crowded phone booth, which is another uh, idea that he uses. It's also used by Rothbard in Power and Market, where he talks about, or I don't know if that was Power and Market or Man, Economy, and State, but he uses the idea of a crowded phone booth where, for example, a fingernail would be justifiable as a weapon, but a knife would not, because everyone is so closely packed together that there is no possible way that a knife could possibly only damage a criminal. In the process of swinging it or stabbing it or whatever, you're going to hit somebody else. So, in that sense, a knife would be illegitimate. But in the reality that we face, where most people are at least a few feet away from each other, a knife is totally okay. Now, bombs, bombs are a special case. Only when all users are criminals, or all victims are criminals, excuse me, would it be legitimate to use a bomb? So that includes grenades, bazookas, RPGs, anything that explodes. You have to make sure that everyone who is in the path of that explosion is a criminal. And if you damage a non-criminal's property, or if you hurt a non-criminal, then you become an aggressor against him. And as we covered in the episode on the court system in an anarchist society, we would that would open you against from a suit against him because you aggressed against him. So now he can sue you and legitimately seek justice against you for harming him. So bombs would be sometimes employed, perhaps in a libertarian society, but not often, because it's quite difficult to ensure that everyone within a rather wide range is actually a criminal. So, going on down the list, clubs, pretty much like knives. Um, you can pinpoint them pretty accurately, unless you're really, really bad at baseball. You can usually use a club with relative accuracy, so that's totally okay. Swords, same way. Nunchucks. Um, Not many people are trained in nunchucks, and they might hurt themselves more than others. But again, nunchucks, if you can pinpoint them, they're okay. Tanks, probably not. Again, only if all the victims are criminals. But they tend to shoot some pretty big bullets. They tread over quite a large area. They can do quite a bit of damage, and so it's important to ensure that everyone you're using the tank against is a criminal, and if not, then you're opening yourself to a countersuit. So, fighter jets, also, pretty much if you're flying over and you're just slamming bullets into the ground, or if you're bombing them or whatever, it applies the same way. It's legitimate, again, it's legitimate to own, but it's only legitimate to use as a weapon if all of the people you're using the weapon against are criminals. And not only are they criminals, I should clarify, but that they are criminals uh, who have either murdered or attempted to murder um, someone, so that murder would be a justifiable punishment. Uh, and we're going to get into proportional force here in a few minutes, but that's what I should clarify. They have to be not only criminals, but murderers or worse. Um, so fighter jets, etc. Use can be a crime. You can use a weapon in such a way that it hurts a non-criminal, and then it makes you a criminal. So use can be a crime, and not all weapons are capable of being used legitimately in that sense. So this is really a consequence of the non-aggression principle, that there's such a thing called proportional force, and we're going to look at a couple different uh, outlooks on violence that uh, are possible. We're going to review what the consequences of those different outlooks, and then we're going to see if they would actually apply, or if they would actually function as a society, and if that society would look libertarian. So the first that I really wanted to get into is the maximalist view. Now, let's imagine a scenario in which someone shoplifts a pack of bubble gum from a convenience store. It's a crime, but it's not a terribly, it might cost 50 cents. It's not a terribly great crime. Now, under the maximalist view, um, any defensive violence whatsoever is totally justified. So you look at this uh, bubblegum thief and you realize that he's shoplifting from your convenience store, and so you turn around and you shoot him and he dies. Now, most people would consider that an unjust use of violence, uh, but under the maximalist view, any defensive violence is allowed, and this is non-arbitrary because it says that any violation of the non-aggression principle, no matter who it is, no matter what circumstances, is it's justified to use any level of defensive violence that you can. So that's non-arbitrary. It would actually, remember, if you remember that we looked back, capitalism, socialism, and hegemony. How hegemony was an uh, arbitrary system where it assigns different roles to different classes of people without that much of a criterion. Um, but capitalism and socialism are both at least non-arbitrary in the sense that they treat everyone in the same way. We're going to use a very similar analysis here, in that we want to treat everyone in the same way. So we're going to throw out any sort of arbitrary view of force. For example, any crime against any person is rightly punished by 5 lashes. Now, that's not arbitrary in the sense that it applies to every person, but it is arbitrary in the sense that it doesn't apply to every crime. Because for some crimes, like stealing bubblegum, 5 lashes might be a lot, but for other crimes, like shooting someone, 5 lashes might not be nearly enough. So trying to apply a single punishment for every single crime is arbitrary. Trying to apply 2 different punishments for every single crime is arbitrary. Trying to apply uh, just a random punishment for any crime is arbitrary. We could make up an infinite number of them, and they would all be arbitrary. These are the only non-arbitrary methods of distributing punishments for crimes, and these are the only ones that we're going to consider. And one of them is the maximalist view. The second is the pacifist view. Now, the pacifist believes that there should be no defensive violence whatsoever. Um, he believes that violence in general is wrong, and while that's not an arbitrary viewpoint because it applies not only to every person but to every crime, uh, it doesn't permit civil society. If we go back and look at the maximalist view, we could immediately see that the bubblegum thief, when he's shot, um, he believes that him being shot at for stealing bubblegum is quite an overreaction. And so he turns around and says, "Okay, you shot me, so now I'm going to shoot you." And then somebody who is a friend of the convenience store owner says, "Okay, well, you shot at my friend, so I'm going to shoot you." And then everything just devolves from there. There's no end to the amount of violence that can be employed under the maximalist system. And so, obviously, that doesn't produce, even though it's not arbitrary, it doesn't produce anything similar to a civil society, much less libertarian. Everything just explodes at the slightest infraction or even the slightest perceived infraction. So the maximalist view breaks down pretty quickly, and I think we all agree on that. The pacifist view believes that there should be no defensive violence. But the problem with that is that even though it may be morally correct, even though no one should use violence whatsoever, is a perfectly consistent moral uh, idea, it isn't a very consistent legal idea. It doesn't produce civil society because then criminals who don't care about ethics and only care about themselves then just run amok across the entire society with no uh, deterrent, no ability to, or no need to worry about what uh, consequences may lay for them at their next robbery or their next murder. They don't have the uh, deterrent that makes civil society possible or civilization in general possible. Um, so maximalism and pacifism are not arbitrary, but they also don't produce anything resembling civilization, and that's why most uh, subscribers to the non-aggression principle have or really what the non-aggression principle means is proportional force. And proportional force permits defensive violence up to and including the aggression. No more. And you can employ less if that's what works. You aren't legally required to employ all the way up to the maximum punishment, but that is the maximum punishment that is permitted. Uh, and the reason for that is because it has to be non-arbitrary. If there's going to be a punishment, why not make the punishment reflect the crime? Or why not? Why shouldn't the punishment fit the crime? Um, and there's a vague idea of that even in modern state law, but it's without the guiding principle of non-aggression because the state is itself aggressive. Um, and so, how could it possibly consistently apply that standard of non-aggression when it is itself aggressive? in the way that it seeks justice. So, proportional force, essentially, what that means is that uh, when someone shoots you, you are entitled, and assuming that they are the criminal, if they shoot you, you are entitled to shoot them back. If they beat you up, you are entitled to beat them up back. If they steal something from you, you are entitled to steal exactly that back, um, up to and including the original aggression. Um, and because that creates restitution, or at least even if it doesn't restore the situation, it puts both back on the equal footing that they were before the crime. Um, some scholars, like Walter Block, have even taken it so far as to say, in the case of an assault, as distinguished from a battery in modern legal parlance, a battery is actual violence being employed, but assault is merely the threat of violence, the fear, the duress that creates. And so, distinguishing assault from battery in a libertarian sense, he even goes so far as to say, just as an illustration, that it could be, for example, that 1 in 6 muggings end in the death of the victim. And so when this mugger is taken to court, he is forced actually to play Russian roulette with 1 of 6 barrels filled, and that is the punishment for because he put someone else's life at risk. He is now forced to put his own life at risk. Um, Even if he didn't take a life, he is required to risk his own life, and that would be a proportional force, that a punishment that fits the crime. That is the ultimate goal of the proportional force standard, is to make sure that the punishment fits the crime. Everybody wants the punishment to fit the crime. That's what that's for. So, moving on, it's been talked about. I don't know how much my audience knows about jokes about anarcho-capitalism. At this point, I believe it's very little. But there's a joke that has gone around the community, and both against the opponents of the anarcho-capitalist idea, that the uh, that nuclear weapons would be prolific in a libertarian society, and that people would use them on a recreational basis, um, and that, or maybe, or they would use them flippantly or casually. That there's no standard of violence, of the proper use of violence, and so people just go around and they just kill each other willy nilly, and they use nukes without worrying about who's a criminal and who's a non-criminal, and it's true anarchy with no rules instead of just no rulers. And that's obviously, as we've talked about, that's not what libertarians believe at all. um, in fact, uh, the whole idea of the recreational McNuke, as it's phrased in the parlance, is totally unlikely. Not because uh, people wouldn't be able to build or own nuclear weapons, but because they wouldn't be able to be used, at least in very many situations, without harming non-criminals. Uh, Now, I believe it was Rothbard in Power and Market who suggested that if the whole city, a whole city, were composed entirely of criminals, then you could be justified, and all of them were murderers on top of that, then you would be justified in leveling that city, uh, so that all of the murderers would be dead. Um, because that would, and even then, you would have the property to consider, the buildings and the everything else that was contained in those buildings, that might be the property of non-criminals, or it might be the property of criminals, but it wouldn't be just to destroy them because they were stolen from someone else. And there's just a host of questions about the use of a nuclear weapon that make it unlikely, even totally impossible, to use without inviting a countersuit as an aggressor. So And another thing that I wanted to point out is that nuclear weapons, chemical weapons, biological weapons, etc., have been developed under the auspices of a statist government, uh, under the auspices of a state which can get away with killing innocents. Uh, an example would be the infamous Obama 90% statistic, where Obama era drone strikes. 90% of the victims of Obama era drone strikes were not the intended target. And that's true. You could literally just Google Obama 90%, and it will bring that straight up. It was super controversial when it came out, but it's not so much anymore. But it illustrates my idea that it was under the state that all of these uh, indiscriminate weapons were developed. Bombing planes, nuclear weapons, biological chemical weapons, all of those things were developed because they have the ability of indiscriminately killing, uh, which obviously goes against the non aggression principle. So those things would not be possible to use in a libertarian context. But nevertheless, they are used today in a non-libertarian context, and that just serves to highlight all the more the difference between a libertarian world in which the rights of every individual are respected, and a statist world that doesn't particularly care if you drop two nuclear weapons on two Japanese cities, whether those people were actually soldiers, were actually combatants, or whether they were innocent people. I don't like to say innocent usually. I like to say non-criminal because it outlines uh, the the focus on crime, on aggression. Because most people aren't really innocent in the sense that they don't even know what crime is. They don't even know what uh, violence is. But non-criminals is the term that I like to use. Although in this context, innocent refers more closely to the idea of being innocent in war, uh, being a non-combatant, I suppose I should say. Those they didn't do their due diligence in finding out whether those people were non-combatants or not, and so that makes that use illegitimate. Uh, Nuclear weapons would not exist in a libertarian context. Um, with that, we are going to conclude. Hopefully, this has been a shorter one today. Um, at least it felt shorter to me. But this is going to be the second question and answer session in the end of the presentation. And if we don't have any other questions, I'm going to give it about 30 seconds. And if we don't have any other questions, then we're going to end. Um, do we have any questions? Well, seeing no questions coming up at the moment, I think we're just going to go ahead and end it right there. And thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. I hope I answered the anonymous requesters' questions appropriately. Um, and everyone have a splendid evening. We will be back here Saturday at 8 p.m. next week to discuss another topic related to voluntarism and libertarianism. Um, Everybody have a splendid evening. See you next week at Saturday, on Saturday at 8 p.m.